At face value, since the last Irish election in 2024, things have been looking pretty good for Sinn Féin. The left-wing populist Republican Party has opened up a decent lead in the polls amid declining support for the two governing centre-right parties. And the victory of independent leftist Catherine Connolly in the 2025 presidential election, backed by an array of left-of-centre parties including Sinn Féin, raised some hopes that a unified left-wing alliance could help oust the Fianna Fáil-Fine Gael coalition at the next election and bring a Sinn Féin-led left-of-centre coalition to power. However, in reality, things aren't actually going all too well for Sinn Féin. Being squeezed from both sides, some left-wing parties and voters are now questioning Sinn Féin's left-wing credentials. This dilemma played out at a by-election in Dublin last Friday, when Sinn Féin lost out to a smaller left-of-centre rival in its leader's own backyard. So in this video, we're going to look at the by-election results and explain why Sinn Féin is struggling. Recent elections in Denmark, Slovenia, Bulgaria and Hungary have shaken up the state of European politics, with major new trends emerging. We dissect these elections in the latest issue of our magazine, as well as explaining what's changing in Europe. That's just one of 80 pages in the magazine though, because as always there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. Now, there were actually two by-elections held on Friday, one in the Galway West constituency to fill Catherine Connolly's seat, and one in Dublin Central to fill the vacancy left by Pascal Donoghue, the former Fine Gael finance minister who's joining the World Bank. We're going to focus on the latter, Dublin Central, as the Galway West by-election, which was won by Fine Gael, is less relevant to this story. In Dublin Central, it was Social Democrat candidate Daniel Ennis who won out. He received the most first preference votes and beat Sinn Féin's Janice Boylan on the 9th count, with more than 12,000 votes to Boylan's roughly 7,800. For context, Ireland uses ranked choice voting, so as candidates are gradually eliminated, their votes are redistributed based on the next preference marked on the ballot. This continues until either a candidate meets the quota required for election or until two candidates remain, at which point the candidate with the most total votes wins. This was a significant result for the centre-left Social Democrats, who've enjoyed a steady rise in the polls since the last election, nearly doubling to around 9%. It means they now hold two of Dublin Central's 4 seats, and they are now the second largest opposition party with 12 seats in total. For Sinn Féin, however, it's a blow. As the main opposition party, they should be primed to win a by-election at a time when the governing parties are unpopular, especially one held in the political backyard of the party's leader, Mary Lou McDonald, who is one of the 4 deputies representing Dublin Central. McDonald, however, sought to downplay any pressure the result might put on her leadership, instead focusing on the poor performance of the two centre-right governing parties. But other parties on the left, including the Social Democrats, stuck the boot in, saying that the result showed Sinn Féin needed to iron out what their position is, following an apparent rightwards pivot. Now, here we need to give a bit more context. Throughout the 2010s, Sinn Féin steadily grew to become a serious challenger of the Fianna Fáil-Fine Gael duopoly, which has held for nearly a century. In 2020, Sinn Féin won the most first preference votes and the second most seats. It was, however, unable to form a coalition, and ultimately Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael put aside their historic rivalry and formed a grand coalition for the first time ever, which also included the Greens. Between 2020 and 2024, Sinn Féin was considered by many as a government in waiting. However, in the year or so leading up to the 2024 election, the party's sizable polling lead collapsed, in part due to a rise in anti-immigration sentiment, seen most starkly in the November 2023 Dublin riots. At the 2024 election, Sinn Féin came third in vote share and second in seats, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael subsequently renewed their grand coalition, this time relying on support from a handful of independents rather than the Greens. This left Sinn Féin in a bit of a bind, as the party's support base consists of migrant-friendly young progressives on the one hand and restrictionist, often working-class voters on the other. To the frustration of the former, Sinn Féin has hardened its rhetoric on immigration and has also been seen as tacking right, or at least becoming more equivocal on other social or cultural issues, including transgender rights and abortion. For instance, Sinn Féin recently abstained on a bill proposed by the Social Democrats that aimed to liberalise rules surrounding the termination of pregnancies, something that provoked anger from other parties on the left. Some parties on the left are now questioning Sinn Féin's left-wing credentials altogether. Social Democrat leader Holly Cairns said at the weekend that Sinn Féin may be at a crossroads with a number of issues and need to figure out where they're going. Paul Murphy, a deputy from the socialist People Before Profit, said Sinn Féin must decide whether it will consistently commit to left-wing positions. And Labour's leader, Ivana Bacik, has questioned Sinn Féin's left-wing credentials for some time now, accusing them of pivoting rightwards on various issues. Sinn Féin members would, not unreasonably, scoff at the likes of Labour trying to police left-wing purity, given that it was Labour that went into coalition with the centre-right Fine Gael in 2011, and the Greens that propped up the Fianna Fáil-Fine Gael coalition in 2020. But voting patterns at last week's by-elections do indicate that this criticism of Sinn Féin's recent triangulation has struck a chord with a chunk of left-of-centre voters. Transfer votes flowed freely between the parties of the left, as was expected given the oft-repeated vote left, transfer left mantra. But Sinn Féin was a lesser beneficiary of this, and in some cases was left out of the circle. In Dublin Central, for instance, it was the Social Democrats that picked up way more vote transfers than Sinn Féin from other parties on the left, like Labour, People Before Profit, and the Greens. Remarkably, Sinn Féin's biggest transfer boost came from independent anti-immigration candidate and prominent gangland figure Gerry Hutch. Ultimately, disquiet with Sinn Féin on Ireland's left flank has implications for any potential left-of-centre alliance. The value of this kind of alliance was made clear at last year's presidential election, which saw a landslide victory for independent left-winger Catherine Connolly, backed by the parties of the left. However, a presidential election is very different to a parliamentary one, and the current gap between Sinn Féin and other parties on the left indicates that the prospect of an alliance is more distant than it was a year ago. For Sinn Féin, being squeezed from both sides, it's not clear what direction the party will take from here. But it's not the only party facing serious questions. In Dublin Central, Fianna Fáil, the party of incumbent Taoiseach Micheál Martin, scored a disastrous 4.2% of first preference votes, its worst ever election performance and not enough to retain its deposit. But with several years still until the next election, likely due in 2029, there's still a lot of time for political machinations, leadership changes, and dramatic shifts in the polls and political fortunes. The latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using the code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I actually told you about one of the articles in this edition of the magazine at the start of this video, but this issue's also jam-packed with other content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions which have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through the timeline, and reaching the ultimate question, has Trump launched a modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent May elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss whether Britain has become ungovernable. Then in the EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, why Europe's energy transition isn't what you expect, and also look at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss if we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. But that's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've even been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy of Too Long today.